That's all right. As always, thanks for coming out on another beautiful evening in Missoula. Tonight's meeting, of course, is a follow-up. I think all of you were in attendance last time. Kind of a direct follow-up to the meeting last time. You'll remember that after I gave an interminable presentation of what was in Module 1, we went around the room and everybody sort of identified sort of priority issues that they wanted to continue to discuss. And so it's our intention tonight to sort of plow through a lot of those. I think some of the issues are probably, we can discuss them now, but I think they'll be, we'll have a more thoughtful discussion as we get additional pieces of the ordinance and begin to consider how they all kind of fit together and work together. But there's no reason to delay, and let's begin to address them. The issues, I think all of you probably received the summary memo of the last meeting. Also, we posted on the website at the end of the PowerPoint presentation the sort of issue list. My sense of the real core issues that were identified last time are displayed here on a couple of slides. A lot of people wanted to talk more about and better understand or otherwise veto the idea of the lot line concept. I'd propose that we just kind of plow along this list, if it's all right with all of you. And keeping in mind that this will not be our only chance to discuss it, I think as we, again, have more of the draft material, some of these ideas will sort of be better crystallized and we'll have a better sense of whether we can support or support them or not. And then, of course, once we have all these individual pieces of the ordinance laid out, we'll put together a consolidated draft, and we'll have another opportunity to see, one, how we've responded to the discussions at the advisory group level. And so that'll be another opportunity to continue to hammer these. But let's begin by talking about the lot line house concept. I just want to be sure, because when you talk about lot line houses, I know that sometimes I encounter folks who understandably confuse this concept with more of an attached house concept, where houses on abutting lots are built to the same lot line and they have a common wall or abutting walls. That's not the case here. This is a detached house product. One of the lot lines is at or very near the property line. It's sort of, the house is shifted to the side as opposed to centered on the lot. You could only do lot line houses within the context of a lot line house development. You cannot put a lot line house abutting a lot that's not a part of the lot line house development. So I know that at least when we had sort of general comments at the end of the meeting, there were some who may thought, oh, that could be a real problem for me because I don't want a house right next to me that crowds me because it's placed in a lot line. That couldn't happen under this proposal. I just want to make that clear, for folks watching at home and stuff. Lot line house is increasingly common kind of residential product, particularly in light of efforts in at least some communities to decrease minimum lot size requirements. They're referred to often as patio homes, garden homes. I've seen the term narrow lot houses used. The whole concept of shifting the house to the side is to provide a more usable side yard as opposed to what amounts to almost a gangway type situation, a very narrow, unusable side lot on each side of the lot. By shifting the house to one side and preventing people from putting windows that destroy the privacy of the abutting house in the lot line house, you really do achieve a more usable side yard situation. When you drive down the block of a block that's a part of a lot line house development, it's imperceptible that it's different because there are sizable setbacks or yards between each dwelling unit. what you'll notice when you drive down the block is, frankly, bigger setbacks because you have, 10 feet or 8 or whatever. You combine the two side yards into one, so that separation exists between all the houses. And again, as we, in an upcoming module, we'll have additional standards that kind of make all these limitations clear. The limitations about you can't do a lot line house abutting, you can't do a zero lot situation next to a conventional lot. That could never happen. You have to, there are strict limitations on windows on the zero lot line side to address privacy issues for the abutting house. And those sorts of rules will be made clear in other drafts. So I just wanted to get the concept on the table, and I'll open it up for you all to continue to discuss your questions and concerns and ideas about this lot line house concept.
Well, I have a process question because this was on my mind from our last meeting. So I didn't speak up about this during our meeting, but I was concerned that there was a sense that perhaps if some people don't like it, it gets taken off the table. And I wanted to understand that better because are we running that kind of process that if a group of us get together and say we don't like something, we get it out of here? Or are we having a conversation where we try to identify interests and put together things that address different interests? Because you haven't really talked to us much about consensus through this process, and last time I heard someone use the word consensus. And having done a lot of consensus work myself, I know that it's a different kind of work, and everyone has to be committed to it, and they have to work hard to try to figure out how to get the interests resolved. And in my experience in this discussion in this community, that has not been the motivation of a lot of folks. So I'd like some clarification from you. Are you really trying to build consensus around this? Are we trying to work out something that we could all kind of say yes? Or can a group of us take something out of the package if we just don't like it?
This is I would not describe this as a consensus-based model that we're attempting to follow here. I think early on in the formation of the advisory group, we did sort of spend a fair amount of time talking about the use of the advisory group. Not the steering committee or not the zoning ordinance oversight committee, as a kind of sounding board. That the diversity of interests on this group is representative of the community as a whole. You talk to your friends and neighbors and are a conduit for information back and forth between this process and those of your colleagues. We are not going to vote on issues as an advisory group. We'll take seriously all of your input, and we'll make our best recommendation, and we certainly hope you'll join us at the end of this process in full support of the overall effort, despite misgivings about one issue or another. So that's my sense of it. If you want to push me further to answer a more direct question, I'd be happy to try, Judy, but that's kind of my sense of it at this point is this group is a sounding board, and you will influence our subsequent drafts of this process, but I don't think we're anticipating that an individual or a single block of individuals will, have sort of direct voting power to say that's off the table. As a draft work product that we take forward to the public and ultimately through a hearing process where everybody gets to sort of weigh in.
I'm glad to hear that because I don't want to have to weigh in on everything. I don't want to have to say, okay, you say this, I say this. Okay, I'd much rather have it just flow and then see where we get and have the conversation.
Well, that's what that's what we're intending. We're obviously early on in a process that's going to take some time, but I want to better understand some of these issues that were identified. So the purpose is, give me your concerns if you have some about the lot line concept. Tell me if you think it's a really great idea that needs to be, and we'll kind of take those considerations into account as we move forward and prepare subsequent drafts and revisions to drafts that have already been prepared. David?
I would like to say on the lot line house, My grandmother in California, she actually lives in one of these. It's the first time I ever saw of it. And it actually looks real nice. I mean, it looks just like a street. I mean, everyone's actually got a big side yard. It just happens to all be on one side. You can't tell the difference. I wouldn't have known it basically if she hadn't told me where the property lines were. A couple key things though. I think you do have to say in the ordinance, if you had one of these, that windows were expressly not allowed, because I can get a window that will meet the building code that I can put on the property line. It's really expensive, but I can do it. So I think you got to give that other person property. So I think you definitely have to say no windows. I think you need to address the runoff of the roof, and that's what this picture kind of showed to me. Basically, the runoff from the roof could be diverted into the neighbor's property. So I think you need to make sure you address that.
Yes.
You know, you have to contain your water as you do now. And then also something would have to be put in, I think, to say that maintenance easements or something would have to be put on the adjoining property. There is a business in our neighborhood that happens to be 0 lot line, and I know there's tension between the two neighbors because the business can't maintain the wall, the exterior wall, because it's on the property line, and so obviously the neighbor has some problems. So I think those things just need to be addressed in the ordinance.
Absolutely. And I know it's unfair to sort of roll out a concept and not roll out the lot line house standards that accompany it. That was an awkward decision, as it turns out, and so some of the if there's reticence about the idea, it's understandable in light of the fact that you don't see these conditions or limitations that apply, and all of them that you just mentioned are a part of our standard package of lot line house conditions. Yes, Lee.
I have a few questions. One of the people I spoke to about this, because that's what we're supposed to do, is talk to people, said, how could this be used if it were abutting an alley? Let's say the house was sitting sideways on the lot, and it was at a 0 setback on the alley, right on the line. How does that, is that part of 0 lot line house? I mean, does that qualify? If these two houses say we're not going forward, but we're in fact front and back, could the 0 lot line be used on the alley?
I don't think so, because I think there would always be a setback required for a principal building from the alley, regardless of its orientation on the lot. But I can't really imagine that scenario, but it's obviously theoretically possible that somebody could propose it, and I suppose that's something we can try and address in the standards as well, to make clear yes or no, that can't happen.
Theoretically, you could have two houses with 0 lot line who are right against each other. In other words, if each chose to have the extra space on the other side, you could have two very tight buildings to one another.
No, that cannot happen under the lot line house standards. There has to be that minimum separation that's equal to what would otherwise be required as a side yard on each side, doubled between each house. So you couldn't do abutting 0 houses.
Okay, then the next question I have is, you had said something about these would be parts of new developments. These wouldn't be something that would go into existing neighborhoods, or would they go into existing?
Well, the districts in which lot line houses are proposed to be allowed, of course, are identified. There's no distinction made between existing or greenfield new kind of neighborhoods. But what I wanted to make clear is a 0 lot line development would have to be planned and laid out as part of a single package, and you could never do a 0 lot line against a lot that was not a part of the 0 lot line development. So even if it happened in an existing neighborhood context, the maximum separation would happen adjacent to lots that are not a part of the development. You can't put the house on the lot line or near the lot line on a lot, abutting a lot that's not part of the development.
Okay.
Heather?
This is more of a process question again. I can see us having dialogues about each of these points that you're talking about, and I'm looking forward to that. I want us to be able to bring our concerns from our neighbors and as individuals and talk about the detail and the level that David and Lee are bringing up. And I'm curious as to if we're going to do more of this discussion at the time you're presenting the standards, or are we going to be talking about some of our concerns that we want to see reflected in proposed standards? I mean, what's the appropriate, we're doing a lot of listening right now and being somewhat sounding boards, but we haven't had dialogue yet, and I'm just curious as to when that's appropriate to go to this level, because that's what I think a lot of us are looking forward to, but I didn't know if that comes in a later meeting or if we're talking about each line item in detail today. Yeah, just kind of a question on overall process and what is most effective from your experience.
Well, I'm hoping to hear from you tonight about things that you just consider to be not workable, not desirable, and things that might work if certain conditions are met. So at the moment, at least, all of our meetings are planned to sort of follow the same function. We roll out a module, you review it, we give an overview of what we think to be the major salient points and new ideas, and you give us your sense of things you want to talk about further, and we sort of just continue that pattern. So I'll try and not talk so much and listen more so that it really is a dialogue.
That wasn't what I was getting at. I was looking forward to, because we have all had a lot of different sides. The group that's represented, we've had a lot of opportunity to talk at each other, but not with each other. So
Sure.
That's what I'm looking forward to in
Sure.
this process. So I
Well,
just wanted to
please
make
start
sure
us.
that happened.
Please start us down that road right away. Yes, Lori.
I just have another clarification question. As I was going through the side-by-side comparison, is this only looking at the residential pieces of what might be included in these districts? I'm looking particularly at the mixed-use districts where I don't see any permitted commercial or retail uses, and I'm just not sure if that's because we're not to the commercial piece of it yet, or what does mixed use mean, I guess, in terms of how you're looking at it with this?
Well, I think what you're referring to is the fact that our proposal is to convert the existing MU district to something closer to a residential classification, because the truth of the matter is that's really how the district is written today.
The mixed-use district is
Yes.
written as mostly residential?
Yes,
Okay.
yes, it functions primarily as a residential district. Our proposal is to accommodate mixed-use development in all the business and commercial classifications in the future, and actually to incentivize residential in those districts by moving away from regulating density per se and going to more of a physical envelope-based approach. But that's all on the table. You're right in pointing out that our district comparisons to date are solely focused on the residential. Practical consideration, that was really all we could accomplish in the amount of time we had, and it seemed to be the greatest interest of the group last time, is in ferreting out the subtle and sometimes big differences between what's allowed now under the residential and what would be allowed under the future.
Okay, so that, I just want to be sure that I understand, and that is that in the present mixed-use district, that the intention of this zoning is, or the way that you've written it here, is to take it more into the residential side of things and not to include commercial and residential in those districts, but to have the mixed use where the residential is mixed in the commercial districts. You start out with the commercial zoning and then add residential to it, rather than starting out with the residential zoning and adding commercial to it. Is that right?
I think that's right.
Okay.
I think that's right.
Will we have an opportunity to talk about, I remember somebody bringing up small businesses, neighborhood stores, things like that. Those would be in residential districts. We'll get to that level at some point, I'm assuming.
Well, yeah, Heather, you should not wait for
Okay.
us to broach those
I'll start.
subjects. If that's on your mind, let's put it on the table. I mean, maybe at the end of tonight's conversation, we could go through this list of things that we identified as a group last time, and then you can say, okay, that was a nice discussion. Here are some other things that we want to be sure and reserve some time to talk about in the future. I will point out that there is contemplated in the highest density residential classification some opportunities for sort of convenience-based commercial services as a part of larger multi-unit residential projects, as is the case today under MU or other zoning options. We're also attempting to craft the neighborhood business zoning classification into something that might be more acceptable to be applied in or near residential neighborhoods as a zoning district. Today we try and accommodate those sorts of developments. We typically do it through a special district or a planned unit development. I think it would be nice if we had a zoning classification that had some predictability to it, that people could say, yeah, I think we could live with that on a corner location in this setting, and treat it as a zoning district so that there's a lot of process involved. So that's another way we're trying to accommodate this neighborhood serving commercial use. Jan, sorry.
It's all right. When I was here at the last meeting, I came out very strong against lot line houses, and hearing the conditions that would be applied to them, it sounds to me like they might be really appropriate for smaller sized lots. And I would think R5.4 and smaller, it would give them more usable space.
Well, that's our hope too. And I think with a lot of these issues, what we'd like is the ability to move forward with a draft that begins to put more meat on the bone in terms of these types of conditions, and for us to sort of reserve judgment, for us to say, boy, I'm leaning against that idea, but I'm willing to continue the conversation over a series of modules. So if we could get to that point, that'd be great. But if you have strong feelings, let me know now, and I'll continue to work on the sales pitch and the standards and the conditions that will make it acceptable. I know, Dennis, this was a chief. You started us out last time. You were in the first chair, but I know a lot of your colleagues on the advisory group had the same sorts of concerns about it. So. Well,
I would agree that I think what you're doing here is great. I mean, because you have clarified in my mind at least a little bit about how these would be applied. Mm-hmm. And I would agree too that we probably have to wait to see more of the specifics as it's applied in the zoning district or whatever once we get to that point. But I think we're all cautious about where we're going here, because as you remember from our initial discussions, trust is always the issue here. We want to make sure that it's in black and white exactly how these things are allowed or not allowed.
Yeah, good. Well, let's.
I've got one other
David,
quick one. This is actually a correction I found, and it's in when you were trying to classify the packet that was handed out on the B districts to compare what was existing and what was new. You actually incorrectly stated the height.
Yes.
B district is actually allowed to have 45 foot existing, yes. And it's going to be dropped in the new.
That is correct. That is an error in the chart.
Okay. But just before it got spread around,
I'm glad you brought that up. Yeah, that's a case where, and we're going to move to height right now, so it's an appropriate time. It's a good segue. I'd say the second most popular topic, if I had to sort of give a general sense last time, was the proposal to increase building heights from 30 to 35 feet in most of the detached house, single family, however you want to call them, districts. And it's true, the draft does propose almost across the board, with one exception being the existing A district is not proposed to increase in height, it's proposed to decrease in height. You'll remember that A and R1 under our proposal would be consolidated into a single district, and we've proposed, in keeping with the general recommendation, is a 35-foot maximum height limit for that district. I think I told you last time that was driven by our sense of kind of modern building trends. And I think the other thing that's really important about the building height recommendation is it's an abstract discussion until we figure out how we're going to measure building height in the future. more than just about any place I've worked of late, the building height measurement in Missoula seems to be a really troublesome issue. We hope to include in the next module that will be delivered to you sometime in the next month, a proposal for measurement standards in general. How do we measure setbacks? How do we measure building height? How do we measure all manner of lot and dimensional standards things? So this may be another issue that we can talk about, but until we understand how we're going to measure building height, it may be a bit of a sort of chasing our tail discussion. I think one of the critical issues with the way building height is measured is, well, it's simple in concept. Where do you measure from on the ground, and where do you measure to? I would say in the measuring to part, the predominant method, there's two predominant methods out there. And both of them appear to be in use in Missoula in various situations. And that is either in a pitched roof type situation, either measuring to the midpoint between the ridge or the peak and the eave line, the bottom of the eave, or to the very top of the structure. Of late, in the past months or years, what's referred to as the modified method has been more common in Missoula, where you measure to the midpoint of the roof. And that's where we end up on that issue is, I think, a really important input in where we establish the maximum building height, because 35-foot measured to the midpoint is a whole lot different than 35-foot measured to the top of the building. And frankly, I'd say that the trend nationally, if it matters at all, and because we're not just following the trend, is to measure to the top of a building, because the uppermost portion of the building does, in most cases, really inform our sense of scale and how big a building is. And measuring to anything but that sort of says, well, that's not really there. That's not height. That's just sort of a shadow, and you don't need to worry about it. So our thinking at the moment, and I reserve judgment until we roll out the module, is we're probably going to recommend that the modified height method be abandoned and we start measuring to the top of a building. So that's another sort of rationale, justification for our recommendation to increase the building height to 35 feet to accommodate pitched roof situations, architectural features, and the like, some of which would be allowed exceptions anyway. Chimneys and things like that would, even under measuring to the top of the building, still be allowed sort of projections into that above the maximum height. So I'm going to shut up, listen to you. Sorry.
Okay, I've got another one on this. There was actually a group of architects and builders that were concerned with the way building height is being modified, I guess, currently by OPG opinions. And the one reason modified height came out is because the last time they redid the zoning, they, instead of a straight setback of 7.5 feet or 5 feet, which was the traditional zoning, which most of the neighborhoods were developed on, they added 5 feet or 1/3 the height, 7.5 feet or 1/3 the height. So, and I know a lot of people don't like it. Now all the houses they see are really skinny and tall. And that's because of that 1/3 setback. That's what creates it. You cannot get a 2-story house. You know, the one next door to you is 2-story house. You know, it's 5 feet from the setback. You're trying to build a 2-story house. You can't even mimic the house next door because your house just got 3 feet narrower. My neighborhood, the lots are 25 feet wide. So, I mean, already you're talking a house that is only 15 foot wide, as long as it's not over 15 feet tall. That will barely compensate a trailer going down the lot with a pitched roof on it. And that's one of the things that was changed in a lot of zones that actually detracted from the more historical development in the zones. So I think that needs to be addressed. Another thing that came out that needed to be addressed is if you have you're supposed to measure from existing grade, but it's been interpreted sometimes that you should actually measure from the new grade, which really messes things up. And you're not allowed to put any large window wells or a sunken patio or a stair to your basement on the outside of the house, because now, flat ground, existing house, you put a stair down to the basement, and all of a sudden the house got 10 feet taller by the zoning code. And it just seems to be ludicrous why you shouldn't be able to, put in a nice window well to your basement, or a stair down to your basement on the outside of the house, as long as it, doesn't go into setbacks or something. But you should be able to do something like that, or put a sunken plaza where, it doesn't affect your neighbors, it doesn't make your house look taller. I mean, half the time you can't even see it from the property line. When you have that kind of situation, you shouldn't be measuring from the basement, which was dug down in existing grade, and you have existing grade all the way around it. It's a hole right next to the house. You can't even see it. That needed to be addressed as well.
Yeah, I'm becoming more and more familiar with all these issues. I really wish you guys, your committee, would have solved this.
We actually did find a ordinance. It was actually from back east, and they actually allowed disturbances within 10 feet of the perimeter of the house. And then so those were things where you could put down a stairway into your basement, or you could have a small sunken plaza, or just a decent well to allow light into your basement. And as long as, you weren't changing, it's still from existing grade, so you can't just cut away the side of a hill per se, and expose this big part of your house. I mean, it's from existing grade. You go straight down, it's in a well. You were allowed to do a certain amount of that. I think that would take care of it, with some caveat that you can't carve the hillside away or something like that, where you make the appearance of the house taller. That would be different. So, thank you.
Yeah, Dennis.
I've given this one a lot of thought, Kirk, since the last time we met, because I did bring the issue up, because I am in the Lewis and Clark area, and that is an A district, which has a 40 maximum. And we've been considering before this whole zoning rewrite of asking to go to an R1, which would have been 30, and that's the primary difference between the two, is the height. I think seeing some of the houses that have gone up in our area and stuff, I think what's happened is, unfortunately, historically, the area developed with small houses. We don't have anything, well, at least older houses are not nearly that high. They're story-and-a-half houses at most. And so it's real scary to people who were in that existing neighborhood now to think that, they don't even realize that, people legally can build a 40-foot house if they want to. It's huge compared to the houses that are there. Right. It's just so historically we never did that until now. We're getting to the point where with lot, costs and everything, and people wanting to build bigger homes, we're going more to the 2-story or maybe 2.5-story situations. So I think that's where the public may get a little concerned on this issue, because, when they realize that is being considered, they start going, whoa, that's a tall house. I sure don't want one of those next to me, so I'm going to, maybe object because they maybe live in a smaller house, because it's just the way characteristically that neighborhood. So I don't know how we're going to bridge that one, but I think that's a concern I think that my neighborhood would have, is that they bought their homes based on what they saw, and they don't like to see all of a sudden a lot taller homes coming up, maybe next to them, being built on a house that, or a lot that, had an old home and they tore it down and put a newer house up that's taller. So that's why I think we're a little concerned that go from the 40 to 35, where we're hoping we're going from the 40 to the 30 maybe. So we'll have to see how, that whole thing develops.
Yeah, and we'll have to see what it really what it means. Given a new measurement approach, we'll have to, I think, inform ourselves, all of us, including us, to test this out. What is the real difference? Because depending on who you talk to, they say, well, this could be 2 feet of difference, and it could be, one way or another, up or down. And then there's another weird provision in the ordinance that allows a 20% height bonus if you've got a roof pitch of 712. So height's pretty complicated. David put his finger on a really important issue with the setback thing. And I think if we could get out from underneath that setback thing, we could make a lot of progress on this issue. Remember, to restate it, the general setback in, for example, the 5.4, which is the R1 and A, is 7.5 feet per side, okay? Or a third of the height of the building, whichever is greater. That can start to really add up. A third of 30 or 35 or 32, wherever number you come in at, it starts to eat up a lot of the lot in a side yard that has of limited value, is one perspective. So if we could maybe get out from underneath that third of the building height thing, that may free us up to make some headway on the height, the overall height limit and measurement issue. How do you feel? Is that third of the building height setback thing a cherished element of the existing Missoula zoning ordinance that people are fearful of losing?
I don't think most people know it exists.
Okay.
I think it's most people who get into the middle of it all of a sudden find out that, what they read in the ordinance is 7.5 feet now becomes this 1/3 of the whole total height. And they're not even aware of it.
One way that potentially you could address it as when you're dealing with height, if you get rid of the 1/3 rule, because to me that just makes really tall, skinny buildings, and you can't match what's in a neighborhood. When you're trying to in infill, I guess that's where this stuff is the biggest problem. Wouldn't you say? Is infill. So, I mean, I think a way you could do it is if you said you set a building boundary. You kind of had one in the commercial, where you could basically, at your setback, you could go up a certain distance. And then after that, to go up higher, to cross this 45-degree plane, you either had to step back or you had to tilt the roof. So, if you're in the neighbor in the side yard, you don't see a 3-story gable end facing your side. You see something that's more appropriate to the neighborhood. And if the house gets taller, it gets taller away from your property where you can't see it and it doesn't impact, your son in your yard or, and just your living in your property. So I think that's something that maybe could be looked at as, having a setback and then having some way where, the building can step back from its neighbors so they don't crowd it. And it keeps the perceived scale from the neighbor's side, more in character.
I was looking back through the growth policy and some of the other surveys that were done in Missoula various times. This was October of '05. And 81.5% of the people said they support protecting and enhancing the neighborhood character. I think that if these, what are perceived as kind of perks to build taller houses, maximize profit on a given plot of land, will in fact end up damaging the overall neighborhood. One of the areas where this was really evident were the 2 monstrosities built over there on Alder, which are completely out of character with the other small railroad houses which have class and style, and all of a sudden you have something that looks like a giant concrete block being built there right on the lot line all the way up. And I think that it's caused a great deal of consternation in that neighborhood. I think that we have to look out for the people in Missoula and not just for the profit motive, and that's protecting and enhancing neighborhood characters. One of the areas that's really going to get slammed by this program is going to be the north side. They have a lot of neat, lovely, old family, single-family homes. Now, we can't call them that. They're single detached homes. But they're very nice, and they are being renovated. And I think the character of that whole neighborhood could be severely impacted by some of these changes. I think the height change is a very dangerous way to go. And I can see it as a profit motive rather than as a character of the neighborhood. I know somebody said last time that the U area had a lot of 35-foot homes, and I went around, most of them are a story and a half. There are few that are apartment buildings, but of the actual homes, they're about, a lot of craftsman cottages and so on, are only 1.5 stories. I think we have to maintain character, or we're going to end up in the bloodletting that's happening in part of Portland, where developers are coming in, scraping off existing houses, and then building very large, massive units. And this has had, I mean, it was an interesting story, I think it was on NPR, about what that did to the neighborhood and the acrimony. And we don't want to do that, deliberately set out and end up doing that to neighborhoods. And there are lots of neat neighborhoods in Missoula, the slants and all around. I mean, the U area is not the only precious neighborhood. There are many, and I think we have to look at it as an overall effect.
Agreed. I really think this issue is one that just requires further study. We just need to do a better job of determining heights of buildings built in the various zoning districts as one of the determinants of character, and clearly we wouldn't want to do anything as part of this process that was anathema to maintaining character in established neighborhood character. So this proposal was not generated in any way to do that. So, but let's give us some time to continue to study the issue and come up and look at the measurement thing and this whole setback thing, and see if we can come back and better inform all of ourselves about how we should do the height thing. Jan.
I just have one thought that's a little different and hasn't been mentioned in regards to height. And I think our sense of energy use and energy requirements is probably going to change how we feel about having really high ceilings and larger homes. And for that and other reasons, I prefer the 30-foot height, but I don't know what a 30-foot height means at this point, so let's wait for that.
Yeah. I think we're all having a hard. It's hard to talk about this in the abstract. I think we need to put real drawings on the table and say this is what it means. This is how it works now. This is how it would work under the proposal, and here is the change in scale or character that would result, if any, from changing it. Certainly a part of, or height is a part of this issue, and I think, Lee, you mentioned your perception that as part of this we should explore other sorts of controls on building mass and scale and character, as you describe it. And so I wanted to be sure and put that on the table and allow people to talk about their sense of whether we need to look at other tools that could be brought to bear. And I think you were primarily discussing in a residential setting, but maybe across the board. You mentioned specifically lot coverage, as I recall, as a tool that is an important determinant of how buildings fit into the area, into a neighborhood. My sense of having worked on these ordinances in other places is other tools are not simply the coverage of buildings, but the coverage of the lot in general by impervious surfaces, driveways, sidewalks, patios, whatever. Some communities consider those important considerations, and that has stormwater, management impacts as well. Some communities attempt to address these issues through regulating the amount of floor area, building floor area that can be placed on a lot in proportion to the size of the lot, the concept of a floor area ratio. David mentioned earlier this idea of a bulk plane where you start at some point on the lot, go up to 15, 20, 25 feet, and then start angling back and tell people to sort of fit their house within that, fit that envelope. That's you remember we did talk about it in the sense of the commercial residential transition issue last time. Some communities use that in a residential setting, where you go up a certain height, then you angle back. And all the portions of the building need to fit within that envelope. That's the concept of the bulk plane. Other communities regulate the height of a wall plate along the side lot line, or the length of it as something that has least visual bulk-related impacts on neighboring properties, and then, other sorts of design and building articulation standards that can be brought to bear. So, enough said. Lee, do you want to get us started on your sense of what's missing?
Well, sometimes we have these design reviews, and you can build this long, tall building, as David, you've described, very tall, very narrow, and they put a little porch on front and say, that's a design. I think we need to work toward design factors that are much more significant. There's also, unfortunately, an attitude that you buy a property and then you scrape off a little house and you build this huge house because you want to impress somebody. And sometimes those houses, those great big fellows, are completely out of character with, again, we're back to character, in the neighborhood. And they seem to loom over. I believe when John Engen was running for office, he kept mentioning the huge building that was built behind his parents' home and what a negative effect it had on them emotionally to have this huge thing right behind it. And so I think massing many areas, Palo Alto, for example, in California, has very tight standards in massing. And it saves the neighborhood for the future. And it doesn't encourage a lot of scraping and rebuilding of great big huge things.
I'd like to see more of this as well, in trying to take a look at how you not overwhelm smaller, older buildings. And I don't know how flexible you can be in the zoning code with that, but some years ago, we're having a discussion of if there could be neighborhood design standards, so that you actually took some of the things that we were talking about, like most everything's only 1.5, so you could only be a half larger than anything else in the block, or some way to tie it back into what's actually present is of interest to me. And I've talked to people about that, so that if you knew that your immediate area, you could have some understanding that there'd never be too much bulk come in there, it would all be within context of what's already there, then maybe you're not going to be so freaked out that downtown some bulk gets in there, because you're more concerned about what seems to be right near you. So I'd like to see something like that, where some of these are available at a neighborhood standard or design level, personally.
David?
I'll fight that. I actually I don't agree with any of these at all. I think I said this once, I've never had a client ask me what the city is going to allow them, to have for the aesthetic of their house. Bozeman has design standards going throughout their whole neighborhoods, and when I lived there, I saw basically the house prices go through the absolute roof, because the design standards were basically designed to have exclusive housing based on labor rates of 100 years ago. Only the really rich people can afford to custom frame a roof so that you got it 1.5 story. I mean, expensive houses use energy trusses. They're not a 2x4 sitting on a sill plate. They're 12 to 14 inch heel at the side. All those things add up. That it costs less to build the house. It costs more to build a new house than you can buy the house next door, property and everything. So you have to be very careful. I'll take my neighborhood as an example. It's all post-war housing, built in the 40s and the 50s. The lot is worth $100,000+ that the house is sitting on, and the house is anywhere from like 600 square feet, maybe up to 1,200 square feet. Well, the value of the land is by far outweighs the value of the structure that's on it. And to say a person can't replace that house with a new single-family house, I'm not talking about putting in a duplex or a massive multiplex, but just basically replace that starter home with a new starter home that has more than one bedroom. I mean, like my house, I got one bedroom for my kids. It's 7 by 11 feet, and that includes the closet, you know. You have to allow people to live, you know, or at least have the opportunity to live. Otherwise, they're all going to just move to the Bitterroot, and, you know, it's going to be, Missoula will be reserved for the exclusive and the wealthy. And you can get to that point real fast, because houses start at about $125 a square foot, and then they go way up after that. And, you know, our houses, when they were built, you know, they bought the land and built the house for $18,500. You know, so there's a huge swing. So that's just one thing you got to be very, very careful of, because you're gonna price our kids right out of the city. The land is already pricing the kids out of the city. Design standards are just going to do it that much faster if you start telling them what their house has to look like. So, thanks.
Go ahead. Oh, Dick.
I think we, when we start talking lot coverage particularly, we need to, and I assume you would, it depends, a single-family home, single-family detached home, lot coverage is one situation. As you start getting into multifamily or attached housing, townhomes or condos, or I mean, you could apply a lot coverage to a single-family home that makes sense, but if you start trying to apply that to multifamily, it won't make much sense, particularly a townhouse that would have a lot that the house may occupy a good share of. Part of the development, you may have that open space, but it's not on the lot. So we need to be careful as we look, if we start looking at lot coverage, that you apply different standards for different types of housing.
Absolutely. Well, we didn't recommend a lot of those tools as part of the sort of base package of residential, you know, in the single-family realm. We've got townhouse standards, we've got multi-unit standards, we've got landscape standards that require, you know, 35% or X% of the parcel to be open and landscaped in some fashion or other. We don't have that for detached houses. And, you know, that's often a line in communities in terms of their sort of regulatory tolerance and their values and their sense of individualism that is difficult for some places to cross. And we didn't sort of feel the need as an across-the-board tool to introduce those tools here. There's also an element of administrative complexity involved. As we continue to add these tools, if we start to say that you can only cover so much of the lot with buildings and so much with impervious coverage, then when when I want to add a deck to my house, then what do I have to do? Do I have to survey the property to determine how much impervious surface already exists and go in? I mean, my sense is that Missoula hasn't had tolerance for wanting to do that to individual homeowners and property owners. And those are the implications of some of these choices. The notion of a discretionary design review process for single-family detached houses in neighborhoods is, you know, in most places it's a non-starter. And I don't, you all inform me about your sense of it here, that in order to dial these standards in correctly, they'd have to be done on a sort of neighborhood by neighborhood basis, because the character of Missoula's neighborhood, it varies fairly considerably. And that then, if we're going to tie that to zoning designation, then that means a lot more zoning classifications with very fine-grained adjustments between them. And so for those reasons, we didn't recommend going much further down the road of additional single-family detached house controls at this time. Now, we did have promised in the Big Ideas report and in future modules to create the enabling authority for these neighborhood conservation districts, where neighborhoods that have a truly unique character that does need to be preserved could sort of get together and involve in a planning process and try and calibrate what the true character of their neighborhood is, and we could use some sort of zoning overlay or some kind of special zoning district to address those situations. So that was our recommendation, and we're kind of still standing by it. But I hear your concerns. So that's kind of where we are on this at the moment. Since Judy has arrived, we can start to take up her issue now. And I know it's not just her issue. This is front and center for a lot of folks, and that is, what does all this update stuff mean on our efforts and our goals in Missoula to, keep the community affordable for, folks who work here and were born here and the children of people who were born and raised here. The true effects can't be evaluated for some time. I think we've made some positive effects. But we're nibbling around the edges. As you probably know better than I, there's an effort afoot. The mayor has a task force or a group that's meeting to discuss ways and policy directions that maybe can provide a foundation for us to get more aggressive. But at this point, we're sort of working within the framework of the existing policies of the city. And those policies say we want to keep it affordable, but they don't say, they don't give us a lot of foundation for establishing big major initiatives within the context of zoning. If the task force recommends and the council ultimately embraces specific policies that need to be advanced, then we're here and we'll be able to implement them. But at this point, I'll just point out a few things that we pointed out last time that, again, help, but certainly aren't the entire answer, and in no way would zoning ever be the entire answer here. But let me remind you that we've recommended a reduction in minimum lot area in our multi-unit districts. We've recommended moving away from the bedroom-based density restriction and going to a single density restriction, and that'll make a difference in terms of the ability to put multi-unit projects in multi-unit zoning districts in Missoula in the future. I mentioned earlier the removal of density limits in our mixed use, our business and commercial and mixed use zoning classifications. Right now, you can't really get much density in those districts at all. And under our proposal, we're saying you can fit as many units in that building as you can fit within the height and other lot and dimensional standards. So it's really kind of removing a disincentive for higher density residential in commercial and mixed use classifications where they'll have less of an impact on established lower density residential neighborhoods. So there's a few zoning things that are in place, but when we start talking about parking, when we start talking about landscaping, when we start talking about other things that begin to add up to the cost, then we'll have a better sense of what we're doing. At this juncture, we don't feel like we've got the policy direction in place to pursue really aggressive, like workforce housing, inclusionary housing type policies as part of the zoning framework. That's a discussion that needs to occur within a policy and planning framework and not simply be pulled out of the hat as part of the zoning ordinance update. We'll continue to try and remove unnecessary regulatory obstacles, unnecessary procedural obstacles towards the provision of more affordable housing as part of this effort. Dick?
You mentioned procedural and regulatory hurdles, I guess, or try to get rid of them. That's one, in my opinion, having spent most of my life on the development side, trying to get projects through. The city of Missoula over the last 20 years has the process to do anything development-wise, building-wise, has become so onerous. It is just so incredibly time-consuming, and in many instances, in my opinion, the end result isn't accomplishing what, I mean, all of these hurdles you have to get over don't make the project any better. When you come out the other end, all they do is take more time and cost more money. That isn't always the case, but in many cases, I mean, we just beat things to death. And I guess that's who we are, maybe, in this community, but it just seems to me, and it just gets worse and worse and worse, and there's more layers and more layers and more boards and the time that it takes to get through the process. I just did a little subdivision of my own that supposedly, and it was in the county, wasn't in the city. If it had been in the city, I'd probably still be doing it. And it got through in record time, I'm told. And of course, I spent 100% of my time 24/7 riding it. And I mean, every day there was a deadline, I was there and I was down making sure that every step got in. And it took me a year. And it was a 20-lot development that was at 2/3 of the density of the zoning permitted, and it was in a record time, a year. I mean, that's just absurd, and the carrying costs become huge. In this case, I'd owned the property for a while, and I hadn't gone out and had to borrow a bunch of money to buy it, but most people do, and that drives the cost of everything that everybody does up. And I don't know that this process that we're in can do much to help that, but anything we can, I think we need to. But instead of getting better, it just in my opinion, it just continues to get worse and worse and worse and worse. And it does on the county level, even worse on the city level. Yes, that's just sort of
Sure.
I'm venting. but that has a big effect on cost. And I don't think a lot of people think it does, but it really does.
So Kurt, when you were talking last time about where you might see the impact for workforce or affordable housing, you referenced the multifamily areas. So I took out that map that you gave us. I wonder if it would just be helpful, or it would be helpful to me to be able to talk to the people that I care about, to say, okay, this is the map that really captures most of the improvements, or whatever we want to call them. And is there any way to give me some more information about, well, how much more? Like, what are we talking about that we're really getting done here? Are we really making it possible to have how many more units, or what kind of flexibility where? Because I think one of the sidebar stories that I want to be able to tell going forward out of this whole discussion is, how is this going to really address that issue, which is a major issue that brings me to the discussion. And if all I can say is, well, this whole thing couldn't really address it anyway, and we're just going to get rid of a few of the barriers, but that's it, that's not going to help me out very much in coming and advocating for this. And this isn't a threat, it's just saying it's just what it is. Sure. If we go through all of this and haven't really done much on what I would argue in many ways is a central issue for the community, then it's a problem. Mm-hmm. So if you could help out with that in the way of taking the information that's on a map, or an idea of projecting, okay, where does this going to make a difference and how is it going to make a difference? Or what we're saying here, will it help the timeline so it won't take a year? I mean, if there's some ways to make it a little more tangible, it would probably help some of us.
Okay. I guess beyond the numbers, which I guess if you're not well, I guess we could take these numbers and apply them to sort of actual sites and give you a sense of what it means to reduce the minimum lot area per unit requirement in XYZ district from this to that. But if you've got other ideas of specific things that would help tell the story that you want to be able to understand, then tell me. But at the moment, I can think of doing that as a way to sort of better explain the implications of reducing the minimum lot area in our multi-unit districts and reducing the minimum lot area per unit requirement, thereby increasing the maximum allowable density. That might put some real, it might make these numbers a little less abstract.
Well, most of the folks who do reports for us come in and say how many units we're going to need in the next blank years and the next blank years and whatever. So we're kind of used to thinking about that, which is how many units and where.
Okay.
So if there's a way that this gets translated a little bit more to say, okay, this is really going to allow us to have this many more units in these many areas or whatever, that I think would be helpful.
Okay. We could try and we can see what we can come up with. Absolutely.
Something that goes along with that, I was very involved in the Franklin to the Ford infrastructure plan, so we got to see the, what do they call the census blocks? Census tract. So they showed the blocks, they showed all these, they're just square blocks, and they said, okay, there's this many rentals in them, there's this many single-family rentals. It said what the density of it was. I mean, it went through a lot of kind of pertinent information. One thing that it brought out is the oldest part of our neighborhood was at, I think it was 12 units per acre, and right now we're zoned to have 16 units per acre. And then it went down, I think, as far as maybe 6 in a couple places. But I think, something that would help the board is to see currently, you're sitting around this, so that you know what the neighborhood is. This is actually how you're developed now. This is what your current zoning says you can have now, so people have a good understanding of that. And then this is what you'd be allowed to do after the fact. And, if you could, I don't know if it's a 3D model where you drew boxes for the houses. This is what's there. This is what you're allowed to do by zoning now. This is what you're allowed to do by zoning after the fact. In some kind of graphic but 3D manner, I think a lot of people would be able to see it and understand it a lot better. And I think the issues, or at least places where friction is going to happen, would become clearer to everybody.
Okay. Well, we'll see what we can do. Working with OPG and their capabilities to sort of map some of this stuff and see what we can come up with that better tells the story. Yes, Lee.
I had the experience of running for council person and losing for this area, and I walked most of it and came to the realization that most of the homes in this area are single-family homes. They are not multi-use or whatever. This is a drastic, huge change to this neighborhood. And
Which, can you tell me which neighborhood are you
well,
referring
I'm
to?
talking about B on here and also on R12. And R12 a little less, but B is really going to get hammered with this. And I know a lot of you want to use it for more affordable housing. I remember once speaking with Dave Loomis, and he said, this isn't about affordable housing, this is about income investment housing. And that says to me LLCs coming in and taking advantage of the land, but it also does make an enormous, huge impact on people who've bought their homes and expect to live there. There were a lot of retired folks, don't have the money to move. One lady just wept because a huge house went up next door and cut her view of Lolo that she had all of her life. And I think that this is an area where a suggestion of reducing the lot size from 5,400 down to 35 or 3,600 is a huge, huge change. Now, I know why you want to do it, but I think it's going to be a firestorm in that area, and I think people are going to be very unhappy. I don't know how much affordable housing you'll actually pick up, because I do think this will become income investment housing very quickly. And talking about characters of neighborhoods, that's a neat neighborhood. It's got a lot of character, and I don't know whether it deserves this violent change. And I think what you really need to do is go out and canvass the neighborhood. And someone suggested finding out what was really available and finding out what people want. Because when you start doing this with whole neighborhoods, it can get very dicey in a hurry. And if we want to be successful, I think people have to go into it and say, okay, what do you want? Go around the neighborhoods. It's not that large an area.
Well, I can't promise any canvassing, but we are going to have another public meeting here in the near future, in September, October timeframe, where we try and get out the word that we're going to reach out and have a status report on what we're up to, and just kind of continue our commitment to keep folks apprised of what's going on as part of this process. And I think I'm really proud of the efforts we've made thus far to include people in this process and let them know that it's going on. And 50-some listening sessions involving hundreds of people in the community, workshops at regular intervals throughout the process. And we're going to continue that tradition, but it's probably not going to involve anybody going door to door. But if you'd like to help us get out the word by doing that, I'd welcome that. Go ahead, Lauren.
I live in the B district, in the Slant Street part of that, and I think I need to very respectfully disagree with you about having this, not having mixed use or mixed housing in the neighborhood. I live in a large older house in the neighborhood, and right next door is a sixplex, and across the street is a duplex, and behind me is a fourplex. And up the street is actually, a few blocks, is a multifamily apartment house, and there are several in that area closer to Russell than where I live. And it really works quite well. I mean, I've lived there for over 20 years, and these aren't changes that have happened. They were there. The fourplex behind us is newer, but the other things were already there. And I think our neighborhood's a really good example of how you can mix those things and have it work. One of the things we also used to have there was the grocery store that was on Stevens. That was the old. There's now a multifamily building there. I forget what it was called, but. So I think our neighborhood really does have some of that mix, and that it can be done in a way that doesn't threaten the neighbors. And there have been a couple of newer houses go in around my neighborhood there, and at first to me they looked really big, and then I thought, now I don't even notice them. I'm kind of used to them, and I don't really notice them. So I think there's room in neighborhoods to really think about that. The other thing about our neighborhood that is really sad, I think, is that the houses there have become so expensive. And these are small houses. They're not big, giant houses with big yards. They do have yards, but they're not giant yards. Is that all the young families they're gone. We have a neighbor across the street who has an 8-year-old that comes to visit in the summer, and they sent him home early because there was no one in the neighborhood for him to play with. And so what's happened in our neighborhood is that the houses have become so expensive that the families can't afford to live there. And so we have a lot of people who come whose children have left home, who are older, or they're living in the multifamily structures around us. So I think it's a really good example of how you can mix uses in a neighborhood and have it really work well. I've lived there over 20 years, and I can only think of one neighbor in the sixplex next door that we ever had any problems with. So it can work. It can really work. I just want to encourage people as we go through this process to keep an open mind about doing those kinds of things because it can be done well.
I think there was also last time around, some discussion of some issues that I had less of a clear sense of the concern. I think people want to discuss the idea of cluster and conservation development, agricultural preservation in the context of cluster and conservation style development, and just as a general theme, much like the housing affordability issue, and then there were some who wanted to talk more about this whole idea of how we transition, but I don't really have anything more to add on that. So why don't I just kind of open it up for other issues that, and we have a kind of smaller group tonight. Maybe the folks who identified those issues aren't even here, but let's open it up for a few minutes, and then I think it's been our tradition to make sure that folks who showed up and are watching us have an opportunity. So let me reserve last 15 minutes or so at a quarter till or 20 till to do that. So why don't you pepper me with other sorts of issues on your mind? Yeah, Jan, go ahead.
Okay. I wanted to talk about the conservation with density bonuses for the RLD4 and R10, because I did some numbers, and it really looks to me like when you have a 10,000 square foot lot and you try to use the conservation system, you end up with a very small piece of property on which to put a home. What I did was I multiplied the 20, you get 20 units, that's the beginning number that you start with. Am I correct?
Okay.
Let me know if I'm...
Tell me your assumptions, first of all. You're starting with a size of property, a parcel of land that's...
Okay. You're starting, well, as I understand the conservation units, you need to have 20 of them to have a conservation application. Is that correct? Because maybe I'm on the wrong page right to begin with.
Well, do you happen to have your draft with you? Maybe we could all follow along, because I think it's always useful for us to kind of go through the exercise together.
Okay.
It should be on page 1905-9. It's chapter 1905, the 9th page of that chapter. There's a chart there that's probably best to work from.
1905-9. Okay, I'm looking at the conservation units.
The conservation unit, you're on page
1905.060. At the 1905-9 it says at the bottom.
Okay, good.
Okay.
And then there's a table, a chart on that page.
Right.
Okay? All right. So you're looking down at the bottom of the table under the conservation development option.
Right.
Okay.
And what I'm looking at is the R10.
Okay? Mm-hmm. The equivalent of the, what do they call that now? The RLD4?
RLD4.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
My question to begin with is, am I correct in assuming that in order to get a conservation subdivision going, you need to have 20 units, 20 building lots to begin with?
Well, the threshold consideration is that you have 5 acres.
Okay.
But yeah, theoretically, I guess that means,
20 units.
yeah.
It does. Okay.
Okay. All
Well,
right.
once we've made that assumption, once we have that understanding, if you take 60% of those out for conservation, you now have 2 acres. and you have 20 houses to go on 2 acres. Then if you have a 20% density bonus, that's another 4 houses. So now you have 24 houses to go on 2 acres. And you have not yet taken out anything for roads, which generally runs around 30%. So you're ending up putting 24 houses on a very small piece of land. It's less than 2 acres. What I'm trying to say here is I really like the conservation concept, and I see that it works with RLD2. It's a little tight, but it's not so tight as with RLD4 or what we're calling R10, because you can end up then under RLD4 or R10 with just 3,000 acres, 3,000 square feet per house. And that would look very peculiar in an area that was zoned R10 or 10,000 square feet for each of the homes that are there. Does that make sense to anybody? If you take out 60% for the conservation easement, you add a 20% density bonus, so you increase the number of houses to 24. You're putting 24 houses on 2 acres, and you have not yet taken out space for roads. So it looks to me like it's really too crowded and maybe not an appropriate place to use the conservation clustering.
You said that's 24 houses on 2 acres?
As I understand it, Dave, that's what it would end up being. If you take out 60% of the 5 acres for the open space, that leaves 2 acres.
2.5 acres. Okay, so I'm just I'm picturing in my mind. I know where there's 12 units per acre in the Franklin to the Fort, and that's our old historic 1930s to early 40s development. So I guess I see the trade-off is we're getting how many acres? We're getting 60% though, and guaranteed open space that the public gets to enjoy. And then we're getting basically like a traditional neighborhood density. The 12 units per acre, I know that's 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, and 7th Street between Russell and Catlin. And that's not like really packed in, you know, over there. So I guess if I was gonna get a whole bunch of preserved property, that the city gets to see a big field where there was always a field, that's not like a real packed in, it wasn't like the PNCs, you know, where the houses were like stacked on top of each other. It doesn't look like that. It's a slightly denser, I guess, than what I'd see the slant streets to be. You know, but I'd be getting basically like a city park the size of Pineview Park as a trade-off, which I think might be equitable.
I really like the park idea
Yeah.
and getting that much space.
Guaranteed park, yeah.
Right, guaranteed park. That's a lot of space. But if you're fitting this into a neighborhood where everybody else has 10,000 square feet for their homes, and suddenly you're seeing people on 3,000 square foot lots, it's jarring. It doesn't really fit with the neighborhood. And what I feel is that you would do much better off to do this in RLD2 and leave RLD4 out of this proposal. And if you just do the cluster development and get 30% open space, it works out very well. Those are appropriate sized lots, and it wouldn't be offensive. I think the lots then come out at somewhere around 7,000 square feet. It would look a lot better in the neighborhood, and you still have 1.5 acres of land that could be used as parkland.
I guess I'd just not reading the detail, the clarification, would this be single dwelling units, individual dwelling units?
That's my understanding.
and I don't know if that comes back to how we address it in maybe not design standards, but some of the more, how does it look, how does it mass, how does it feel? And the reason I bring that up is the calculations you're running are very similar to a multifamily project we did out at Orchard Gardens, and we had 4 acres, and we have 35 units on 2 acres, and they fit into the context of the neighborhood because we have the deep setbacks, but they're multifamily buildings. There's 20 units in one large building, and they're broken down and clustered, and then the 2 acres is preserved for agriculture with Garden City Harvest. Well, that's kind of like, that would be the perfect scenario for us. We had to write our own zoning district to make that happen with that intent, and so, you know, we put our own design standards and wanted to fit the character of the neighborhood and scaled it a certain way. But again, those are multifamily, not individual units. So I'm not, and when we tried to scale it out as individual units, right, it takes up a lot of space and the roads and all of that. So I don't know if a lot of the concern about what you're bringing up would be washed out in certain standards or characteristics, or because I would love the opportunity to develop something like that instead of having to go through the hoops that Dick mentioned around spending a year rewriting our own zoning district.
There's still public process, right? In the new conservation.
What was the question, David?
There is public process though, right? If you're trying to do a development with conservation, I mean, in some, I guess,
Well, the
some way
subdivi-
that neighbors get feedback to make sure their concerns are addressed. That would be actually kind of important, because I guess what I'm looking at is, say there was something the neighborhood cherished. I'm kind of thinking the Apple Grove. You know, it had the old Apple Grove, and there was a sense of space right off Rattlesnake Drive. So I guess if I was, well, I mean, I grew up a block from it. You know, I loved seeing the field. You know, and there was well, you know, they didn't get any preservation bonuses up there where they could save more. So I guess as long as the neighbors could say, look, if you've got some density and and if you could put the density over there and we agree to that, you know, and there's you know, and we would like some kind of setbacks, you know, there was process where the neighbors got to say, but then they got to keep something that was like cherished. Maybe it's a view, maybe it's a butte, or something like that. I mean, to me, that was the intent of the conservation. Otherwise, you know, why go through it? Just chop it all up, mow it down, and, you know, so I don't think it pertains to the people that want to do it easy. You know, it's people that they want to save something. I guess that's what I assumed the intent was. Maybe I was wrong. Okay.
Let me clarify a couple things. Under the open space or cluster and conservation option, you do have the ability to do townhouse and multi-unit buildings as opposed to detached houses. Under conventional development option in R10 district, it's just a detached house district. But once you do the open space and cluster, then you do bring in the ability to do an additional building type that may influence your decision about how tight the arrangement is. To answer your question or to refute your assumption, the way it's drafted right now, conservation and cluster development would be allowed as of right and reviewed only through the subdivision platting process.
Okay, but it's
There's a process, there's whatever notice is involved in that, and people do have an opportunity to come forward and express their views and preferences, but it's not a sort of discretionary rezoning or PUD type process, at least as it's currently worded, because we see that as a procedural disincentive to actually doing. It's hard enough to get people to do conservation and cluster development without saying, oh, and by the way, it's probably going to take you 6 to 9 months longer, and there's going to be a lot of brain damage involved. I just, laying it on the table. If we can get the standards in place and we can agree on what those standards are, then can't it be more of a ministerial process that involves public review, but a different kind of public review than does other forms of development?
Yeah, if it's going through subdivision review, it'll get reviewed.
Okay. Good.
Minuteness of detail. So as long as it's attached into that and you just can't
Absolutely.
have a big field and,
Yeah.
you know, this is what I'm doing, I'm fine. Yeah, it's gonna get a lot of
Okay.
comment.
Okay.
And I just assume that it would be good procedurally to avoid some of the brain damage to make it predictable for both the developer and the neighborhood. So if it washes out in those standards, that's great, but just know that that brain damage is real and expensive. So we want to avoid that.
Well, that is the idea, and I appreciate you bringing this up, Janet. You know, maybe this part of the answer here is in ensuring that there's some kind of standards or criteria for where the cluster of houses is relative to the existing neighborhood. If it's a situation where the proximity is really tight, maybe there does need to be some special considerations. And frankly, the draft doesn't address that at the current time. Leslie.
I believe the current RLD4 allows for 2 single-family homes or a duplex, but then you have to have 20,000 square feet. You can't do it on 10,000 square feet, and I want to make sure that this doesn't get warped somewhere along the line. Interestingly enough, in the existing RLD4, it's 10,890, and now it's been chopped down to 10,000. All the way through the cluster and the larger development processes, there is a substantial change in the size of the lots, and almost always in favor of development. And I'm not sure that helps with the conservation to make the lots essentially much smaller. Not unbuildable, but they are dramatically smaller. So I think we need to look at this very carefully. I did have a place once at Brookside up in the Rattlesnake, and those are townhouses that are all, many with joined walls. And the way they were designed to preserve a lot of the area around them and a nice area in the middle. And they worked out. Now, that was a PUD, but I would be very, very careful on how we do this, because you could end up with a Lincoln School type of project, which is going to be kind of hard on the neighborhood.
I guess that would be the comment, that adjacency would have to be addressed as part, so it's not just as of right. I mean, in some way, it must address the adjacent properties so that they are not negatively affected. You know, it's got to go through subdivision review, and there just isn't anything easy about that. But just so someone, you know, cannot just say, I'm going to cram them against the neighbor's yard, basically affecting their view and their privacy. That's why they live, I assume, on that big piece of property. There has to be some kind of adjacency consideration that must be done, and then maybe if it needs to be narrowed, you know, that's something that the council would have to approve as part of the subdivision.
Okay.
So it protect the neighbors.
So you're talking about maybe ensuring that some of the open space is a sort of buffer from the existing neighborhood context?
I guess I'd see it as setbacks.
Okay.
You know, you can't decrease the setback where that cluster is going to go. You know, so if, say there's 50-foot setbacks, you know, you can't squeeze it down to 7.5.
Okay,
In a
sure.
cluster, you know, in the intent to preserve something, you know, if you want to reduce that adjacencies setback, you know, you're going to have to get like a special approval by council, because I suppose in a case, you know, say it was like the butte on the other side of town, you know, the butte was most important, and so, you know, people were willing to squeeze it up to the road or something. It would allow to be done, but it should be like on a case circumstances. But you would have to maintain that adjacent property's setback on your property, therefore maintaining basically their quality of life that they enjoy right now.
Got it. Yeah, Dennis.
I just want one clarification, Kirk, and that is it my understanding then now the idea of a cluster development as an overlay is not going to happen anymore? I mean, because of the PNC concept. We kind of threw out that idea in the initial conversations, right?
Yeah, yes, yes.
I mean, what we're talking about here is cluster for new developments, right?
Yes.
Okay. Because that's how I see it. I just want to make sure, planned neighborhood cluster idea is not really included in
We are, our thinking at the moment is we are not attempting to come up with a one-for-one replacement to the PNC concept. We are attempting to offer, flexibility and other means of accommodating reasonable development within the city, but there's no plans afoot to sort of reinvent that in whole cloth and in a one-for-one fashion.
Well, so in the charts here where it says not applicable, that means not
That
applicable. in
not
zone.
allowed is really
Not
what
allowed
that
is what it
means.
means. Okay.
Not allowed.
Okay, thanks.
Well, let me make good on the promise to let anybody who wants to talk. Ken? Anyone? Yes, go ahead. You want to maybe use the microphone, please? So we can record your comments. Here, let me,
I have written this to the Planning Commission already, and I live in the university area and am surrounded by single-family dwellings, which are now apartment houses. And the problems that come along with that are overwhelming. And I would like to see the zoning laws include something to restrict developers and real estate people from buying those houses and renting them out by the room without providing parking, garbage disposal, lawn care, and other things that are required for everybody else in our whole Missoula Valley. And that would be my comments. Thank you.
thank you. Anyone else? Going once? Okay. How about the group itself? What else? What else you want to try and cover in our waning moments here?
Wasn't there something in the Missoulian recently about something with renters? It's a new ordinance, or is it inspections? Just inspections? Just inspections.
Yeah.
Okay, so it doesn't address it. Okay.
So I'll pick up the agriculture for a minute.
Good, yeah.
When I brought that one up last time, I wasn't quite understanding why it was not allowed in some of the areas as opposed to being conditional. So I'd have to look back with the detail here, but in some of the areas, both animal and crop is allowed, and then in areas it's just crop. And so my concern was just to ask why it was all of a sudden not allowed, especially since we went through a discussion of having a chicken ordinance and some other things here. So to me, that's going backwards as opposed to going forwards. And so it would be fine with me if it was going to be more conditional for animals in certain areas, but it seems to me it should be at least a conversation that can be brought up. Because there is quite a bit of interest in that topic in Missoula, and not just in certain neighborhoods, but there's some chickens in my neighborhood, and I think they're
sure.
fine and they should be
Sure.
there.
Sure. Yeah, this is a kind of a definitional issue. It's a good question and completely understandable, but this would not undermine or in any way roll back the chicken ordinance work. In other words, our definition of animal agriculture doesn't include the keeping of chickens pursuant to that ordinance. This is really geared more towards true livestock within more urban residential districts and the existing prohibitions on that. I mean, that's why you had the chicken ordinance debate in the first place, is there were restrictions in place on the ability to keep animals for so-called
Right.
agricultural purposes. But the urban chicken ordinance will live on under this proposal. And we'll do everything to be consistent with it. Moreover, and this is, I think, pertinent to the conservation and cluster development option, there are folks that we've talked to that say, we can do more to use those tools to help us preserve prime agricultural lands in Missoula. And one of the ideas that we've been talking about is, well, I wonder if we could, if you're preserving prime agricultural lands as part of your conservation or cluster development, could we somehow give you a sort of bonus for that land? Could we count it as, each acre of prime agricultural land counts as, a bit more than an acre, because we really want to provide an incentive. I know that's that's kind of a big policy initiative as part of the growth policy and ongoing debate. So we're continuing to look at ways in which the ordinance can do more to encourage preservation, conservation of prime agricultural lands.
Yeah, I saw that in the discussion when you were saying a certain percent for particular criteria, and I like that idea.
Good.
And definitely there's a large question around prime agricultural land now, because if we don't do anything in the next very short period of time, it will be gone. And the question is, what is it that we can do in the realm of possibility given what we have? We can't go buy it, which is what we've tried to do with the open space bonds. So short of buying it, then what incentives can we give? So I'd be encouraging of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we're going to continue to try and work on that. Yeah, David, go ahead.
I guess one thing that I think it's got to work both ways. I grew up in the Rattlesnake, and there was actually, there was big horse ranches. We had lots of horses. We had llamas. There was sheep. I saw it all just go away and turn into subdivision through my life up there. So I guess it needs to work both ways. If an existing agricultural use, which is unzoned currently, and the city is annexing all of it around it, has a tendency to push that agricultural out. So I guess the ordinance should address the fact that the infrastructure of that existing farm or ranch should be allowed to be preserved, because they say, I'm unzoned, I want to be zoned agricultural. And then all of a sudden, all his barns, which are too close to the property line, all of a sudden, he's out of conformance, and you have to say, well, no, it won't work, or you have to move your barns and your chicken coops and your stalls because we're going to put a big subdivision right next door, and you're going to impede on these people's yards. Those subdivisions need to take responsibility for the fact that they're going next to that agricultural, and it shouldn't be into the detriment necessarily of the agricultural. We're trying to preserve that way of life and that ground. So, right now, I think it would actually go against them to rezone it from unzoned, and he said, to agricultural for the point of preserving it, because it doesn't take into account that he may be non-conforming if he was able to put the zoning on it. So therefore, he wouldn't be preserving anything. So I think it should be allowed to, you've got to say, you can't just move the horse barns because the subdivision next door thinks they smell bad. He's going to say, okay, fine, I'm just going to get rid of the horses and I'll subdivide. Some way it needs to protect him so that they can have it.
Yeah. A sort of right to farm kind of approach. Yeah, I don't really think that zoning has much impact in that, but nuisance complaints do increase as people move to the nuisance, so to speak, and then complain about the very thing they move next to. There's no doubt that happens, and zoning gets sort of caught up in it. But as a practical matter, their zoning really isn't really going to affect that farmer. But the practical matter is that the hassle factor is going to increase for him or her. So and I guess we'll look and see what we can do. The whole idea of accommodating agriculture within the context of a conservation development, it presents some of those very same challenges. You know, you got to design it so that there's access to the farmland, and you got to give people notice that they're going to be moving into a new development that is next to a working farm, and living next to a working farm means X, Y, and Z, and just, you know, sign on the dotted line that you understand that, and don't later come into the city complaining that this person's trying to eke out a living by farming, you know. So I understand the issue, and we'll see what we can do. Yeah, Lee.
I'd like to address this lady's concern. There is a court ruling called State v. Stewart, which said in R1 single-family home, if you have a rental, it must be part of the household. This went all the way through the Supreme Court. It was proposed by Fred Van Valkenburg, and it went all the way through the court system and was ruled that in R1 and the equivalent single-family home, you must, if you have a renter, have that individual part of the household. That means you don't make a separate kitchen for them or other facilities. You also can have controls on rooming houses, so to speak. And I think it's something that should be added and considered into the zoning, especially in areas where there will be a lot of college rentals. And it's not anti-college kids, but it's just a reality that there are some incumbent problems when older homes have been turned over. I don't think there is any enforcement in Missoula of State v. Stewart, but it's on the books. One thing we could say about single-family homes or single detached homes is one kitchen facility, and so that multiple kitchens can't be put in for multiple boarders. Specifically in State v. Stewart, they said one kitchen facilities in these homes. So I think it's something we need to look at for the future. Thank you.
Okay, I'll have to look at that, and I don't mean to be at all dismissive about the comment. It's a very common concern, but my experience is zoning's can't really do much about renting of property. Zoning doesn't make those sorts of distinctions, and from what you described, I don't think you described zoning as making that sort of distinction. Carving a detached house or a single-family dwelling unit into multiple dwelling units we can control, but the ability to rent out a single dwelling unit to multiple individuals is, I'm sorry to say, not much we can do about in zoning if we wanted to. So I just need to be honest about that. But certainly, I think we can make clear what a dwelling unit is for the purposes of zoning. Well, we're down to our last few minutes, so yeah, Heather.
I almost refrained from saying this, but I'll bring up the subject of PNCs again. I know we don't want to resurrect them in any way, shape, or form, but I did bring it up at the first meeting. I think there's some really good intentions around that. Whether they were used and put in place, that's in question, but I wouldn't want to just throw baby out with the bathwater kind of thing. I want to make sure that we're still addressing some of those good ideas and good intentions with the PNC. Can they show up in other areas where we do incentivize the right kind of developments for affordability reasons and clustering and those things? I just want to make sure those show up and are available in zoning in the long term, but in a positive way.
Good. I know you're going to hold us accountable on that point, and it's one of the many things on our list. Well, here's where we go from here. Laval is not with us tonight. She's on vacation, lucky soul. And we have not yet proposed or determined when the next meeting date of the advisory group will be. I suspect that it will be sometime in late September, probably no later than early October. And I think what we're going to try and do is the next time that we come to town is do an advisory group meeting and probably try and do one of these community open house workshop meetings, just kind of a progress report. Here's what we're up to, here's what we've been talking about, make sure that people have an opportunity in another forum to find out what's going on and to tell us what they think about it. So we'll let you know when the next meeting is going to be, and with ample sort of advanced notice. It'll probably be about the same time that we give you the next piece of the ordinance, what we're calling Module 2, which we think is probably going to be the end of this month, end of August, no later than early September. So in the next few weeks, you'll be getting another draft, and we'll give you a few weeks to look at it, and we'll have another meeting. So stay tuned, and again, thanks as always for helping us. Have a good one.